Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Synergen Leadership Podcast. My name's Julian, CEO and co-founder of Synergen Group. And look, today's episode I speak with David Pich, who is the Chief Executive of the Institute of Managing Leaders. A particularly interesting interview today because David explains what the Institute actually does, and that's all about providing a chartered status to anyone that goes through their accreditation process. And he also takes the time to share his leadership journey and some of his lessons along the way. So I think you'll find it a really useful interview, specifically if you are someone that really wants to continue to develop your leadership and get recognised for that. So have a listen. Love to hear what you think. So head over to iTunes or Stitcher, leave us a review, and happy listening.
Welcome to the Synergen Leadership Podcast with Julian Carl. Julian speaks with leaders from around Australia to bring you their leadership story and share their insights about being a leader. To further help you build your leadership capability, Julian shares his own insights about leadership and the tools and techniques he uses as a leader.
Welcome, David, to the Synergen Leadership Podcast. Appreciate you taking the time to be a part of it. So that the listeners have some context, could you share a little bit about the position you hold and the company where you work at the moment?
Yeah, thanks, Julian. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm absolutely delighted to be chatting to you. So I'm David Pich, and I'm the Chief Exec of the Institute of Managers and Leaders, which many of your listeners may not have heard of, but I'm sure most of them would have heard of the Australian Institute of Management, or AIM, and we rebranded in around about July last year and morphed into the Australian Institute of Managers and Leaders, or IML, as we call ourselves.
Okay. And can you share with the listeners an interesting fact that they may not know about IML?
Oh, well, I mean, I suppose in one sense I've just given away probably the most interesting fact, and that is that we used to be the Australian Institute of Management, but there's a couple more here. So one very interesting fact I would hope is that we are the oldest leadership institute in the world. So we are 77 years old this year, and we actually started out as the Melbourne Technical College back down in Victoria, and we've had a couple of name changes over the years. For the vast majority of our history, as I say, we were the Australian Institute of Management, and we've only been IML for less than 12 months, actually. But yeah, no, we have a long and rich history, and we have a membership base in excess of 10,000 members.
Fantastic. So I'd like to take you back all the way to the beginning of your leadership journey. Are you able to share what your very first leadership role was, such as who it was with and what you did?
Yeah, of course. So I graduated from university. You can probably tell from my accent, I have a slightly northern English accent. So I was born in Manchester and I went to university and I graduated and I joined Cadbury Schweppes. Many of your listeners would probably have a similar story of luck in their career. And I had a stroke of luck at Cadbury Schweppes. I worked in the HR department. Actually, within Cadbury Schweppes, I actually worked for the division which was known as Trebor Bassett, and they are famous for, amongst other things, licorice all sorts. And I had a stroke of luck in the HR department. I was a lowly and very excited HR officer, and somebody in the HR team went on maternity leave, and I was asked by the director of HR to take over for the maternity leave cover for about a 6-month period. I was the head of remuneration for Trebor Bassett at the ripe old age of 22. And as I say, it was a stroke of luck, but that was my first management position. I won't say leadership. I was definitely a kind of technical manager, managing a team of one, so me and somebody else. But I essentially ran all of remuneration for Trebor Bassett, and at the time they had about 4,000 staff. So that was my first toe in the water of management and leadership back at the age of 22. Yes.
That's a nice young start for you.
Yeah, I have absolutely no doubt, Julian. I was absolutely terrible at it, but I've learned a few lessons along the way. But yeah, no, I think many people, when they reflect on their career, can think of times when something either fell into their lap, or they got a stroke of luck, or somebody had tremendous faith or confidence in them, and that was the start of mine. And I was incredibly honoured when the HR director of Treble Bassett asked if I would cover the maternity leave, and I genuinely think for those 6 months I pretty much had no idea what I was doing.
And were there any specific learnings that you took away from those 6 months?
Oh, look, I think I'm more than happy to share this story. The biggest learning that I took away from that, and I have to kind of move that story on a little bit, because essentially what happened was I took that role, and then at the end of the maternity leave, when the lady who was incredibly experienced in remuneration, an incredibly experienced leader, came back to work, I, of course, really wanted to continue in management and leadership. So I actually left Cadbury Schweppes, and I jumped to the very first job that I was offered. And here's the learning. The learning is don't jump without investigating and without doing your research. Because I jumped to an organisation that was essentially very old, and it was an insurance company actually in the centre of London in England. And I was offered the role of head of remuneration. I was only 23 by that time, and culturally the organisation was A, a million miles from Cadbury Schweppes, and B, a million miles from my own cultural value system for an organisation. And that was really my first, definitely not my last, but definitely my first career mistake. And I think it's always worth reflecting on career mistakes, but it was definitely my first. And the thing that I learned was, A, don't jump for the wrong reasons. I jumped for money. Back in the day, I think I was offered an extra 500 quid or something like that, which at the time, when you're 23 and you've not long since left university, the carrot was dangled in front of me, and it was absolutely the wrong move. In fact, to illustrate to your listeners that it was the wrong move, I only stayed at the insurance company for 3 months. Such was the culture of the company, and such was the conflict of that culture with the things that I believed in then and still believe in now, in fact.
And so you mentioned that you made the deliberate decision to, although it ended up being the wrong one, to move into another leadership role. So was that because after the taste of leadership and management in that first role that you decided leadership and management's for me?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, I'd done it for 6 or 7 months, and, I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed managing somebody and the responsibility that came with that. And I think that's quite a natural reaction. I mean, looking back with hindsight, I could potentially have tried to find a different role in Cadbury Schweppes, but I was, full of confidence, and my chest was puffed out and all of those kind of things. And, I was very young, and, the location of this new company and the role just seemed so exciting and different. And I went there, and I soon realized it wasn't exciting, and it wasn't that different. Oh, well, it was very different, but different in a bad way. But yeah, no, I really, I dipped my toe into management and leadership, and I wanted more of it. And I think again, with hindsight, that's not the bad thing. The bad thing was that I went to the wrong company. And moved on quite quickly. But you're absolutely right. I wanted to do more of that management and leadership stuff.
So you made the decision to move on after 3 months. Was the next move the right one for you?
Yeah, the next move was probably, I'd say that I'd made a mistake, and I think it's always a wise thing to admit when you've made a mistake, and also to do what, you have to work in organisations, I believe, that fit your cultural base, your cultural heart, your true north, as it's called these days. And the next company I joined absolutely did meet all of those things, and that's because it was Hewlett-Packard. So I joined the HR department of Hewlett-Packard, and I was the generalist HR manager for what at the time was probably HP's most strategically significant division. So it was their computer products division. It was the division that made all of Hewlett-Packard's computers, personal computers and printers. And I was the HR manager based in their head office in the UK, which was in a place called Amen Corner in Bracknell. And that, of course, many of your listeners would know that was the time where the cultural philosophy of Hewlett-Packard, which was then and is still called the HP way, was in full force. And the HP way, the cultural setting of the organization, was owned, for want of a better word, but it was really managed and led by the HR team. So, to give you an example, HP in the UK was one of the first organizations to introduce paid maternity leave. And that was actually run by the HR team whilst I was in that HR team. I played an absolutely tiny part in that, but it was run by the team that I worked with and worked for. And I stayed at Hewlett-Packard in a number of roles. I eventually did move out of HR, and I moved into a sales and marketing role. And then I actually was transferred by Hewlett-Packard in the UK to Australia, and that's how I ended up in Australia. So I stayed at HP for a long time, and HP was really the organization where I learned the most about myself in a work context and my own management style. And even today, when I look at my own management and leadership style, much of it comes from what I learned at Hewlett-Packard and from the people I worked for and worked with at HP. It's probably the defining organization. I would imagine many of your leaders, if they're listening to this, can think of those organizations that kind of define them in a work context or their leadership style. And for me, it was Hewlett-Packard.
Okay. And were there any significant successes which really stand out for you? You mentioned the paid maternity leave. Is there anything else that really stood out for you in terms of what you're able to achieve through your leadership?
Yeah, so there's a couple of career moments for me personally. And there are also things that I was involved in. And probably the most significant thing that I was involved in from an HR perspective was, and this will sound strange, of course, because here we are in 2018 talking about this. But at the time, Hewlett-Packard only sold its computers to third parties, and then they sold them to end user consumers. Now that's changed, of course. Now you can call up and you can buy these things direct. But at the time, HP didn't do that, and it was changing to that model. So there was a very significant cultural change going on in the organization. And that meant, for example, that it was, setting up contact centers to deal with customers directly. And all of these things were very new to the organization. And I was intimately involved in that with the leadership team of the computer products division. So I was assisting with putting together, contact centers and recruiting people to work in call centers. And Hewlett-Packard didn't have any of that, of course, because these were consumer-based, end-user-based contact centers. And that was incredibly exciting because it was part of a very significant change in the business. So I guess that was, I was very close to the center of the strategy. And I was setting the HR strategy that really supported the business strategy, and that was incredibly exciting. And from a personal perspective, I think probably the most defining part of that was because of my work with the leadership team of the computer products division. They eventually asked me to leave the HR team and join the sales team. So making that jump from a support part of the business, which was HR, to a customer-facing part of the business, which was the sales team, is something that I was incredibly proud. I was incredibly scared of at the time because I'd been in HR all my life, and I moved out of HR into sales and marketing, and so that was a personal development moment for me.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't mind exploring that a little bit further if I could, because that is
sure.
That is, in my experience, an unusual move from HR to sales. So how did that come about, and what were some of the challenges that you found when you moved into that sales role?
Well, it came about really because I sat on the leadership team of the computer products division, and as I say, it was the biggest, most profitable, and most successful division. So to sit on that leadership team was an incredible honor, and I was very close to the center of the strategy, as I said, and I was the person that was expected to implement the HR and the people and the culture side of the strategy. But it did mean that I sat in leadership team meetings, I sat in performance meetings with the head of the division. His name is Alan, was at the time Alan Furness, and was, in my view, a really fantastic leader in the organization. And there came a time when there was a position vacant, and he asked me whether I was interested in skipping out of HR and into sales. Now, interestingly, I'm a bit of a believer in skills and in the importance of skills rather than disciplines. And I think you'd probably understand, Julian. I think if you're in HR, you're essentially, part of you is a sales and marketing person. You've got your policies and your processes, and you've got to find, unique ways of implementing those to support the business. So I personally don't see huge differences in the skills that you need to bring to various disciplines. And certainly, I did a lot. I'll give you a classic example. In HR, I did an awful lot of standing on my feet and presenting, and talking through various ways of implementing solutions. They just happened to be HR solutions, but I didn't find that too different from when I was trying to sell a product. I had a product that I had to stand up on my feet and sell it and offer the customer what they wanted. So I'm a real believer in focusing on the skills of a role rather than getting too hooked up on the discipline of that role or the theory of that role. And I think that's perhaps that's a lesson, that's stuck with me, that, if people are thinking of jumping from one career to another, I think it's always a good idea to focus on the skills, rather than the actual discipline that you're involved in.
And ultimately, why did you decide to leave HP?
Oh, look, I'd been transferred, so I took an internal transfer from London to Sydney, and once I'd arrived in Sydney, I did stay with HP for about 3 years. So in total, I was probably with HP for about 10 years. I just wanted a change, and another opportunity came up with a different organisation. Again, it was in the IT sector, but I just wanted a change, and I really wanted to expand my horizons and work for a different organisation. And so I moved to Computer Associates, and I moved into a market development role at CA. And I have to say, I didn't really enjoy it. I found it a very, very different culture to Hewlett Packard. I found the culture at CA at the time quite aggressive, sales aggressive, I mean, and a little less appealing to my own personal view of teacher. So I didn't. I stayed at CA for about 12 months. I didn't particularly enjoy it. Now, I obviously don't know what the culture of that organisation is like now, because this was a fair while ago. So yeah, the reason I left it was I just fancied something different. I'd been there for 10 years, and I fancied some change in my life,
Okay. So you've had a taste of leadership in a couple of different roles and organisations. So I'd like to fast forward to your current role now. Are you able to give the listeners any more context about what your role involves at IML, number of reports, all those types of things?
Yeah, sure. So there is something quite interesting about my role at the Institute, which is probably just worth explaining to your listeners, and it's this. So I'm the first chief exec of the National Institute, which was AIM at the time, but is now IML. So just to give some context on that, AIM used to be 7 state-based bodies, and they all sat loosely under a kind of national structure, but they all had their own state-based head office and their own management structures, including CEO and various associated operational support teams. In 2014, those organizations decided to merge into one national body, and I'm the first chief exec of that national body. So I have, all around Australia, we have offices in all states and territories, and I have about 70 staff. Now, I say about because I have some kind of part-time staff, and we have member liaison staff who work just one day a week in some of our, what we call our regions. But I have about 70 staff in all states and territories. But I run the organization on a national basis, and I'm the first chief exec to do that. So I was recruited by the board to put the strategy in place for the nationalised entity that was called the Australian Institute of Management, but is now the Institute of Managers and Leaders.
Okay, that sounds like an exciting opportunity.
Yeah, well, the thing the thing that's most exciting, or was at the time, and actually remains most exciting about the role, is not only am I the first chief exec of the nationalised organisation, and for a membership, a 77-year-old membership organisation to decide to nationalise with that history and to come together and dissolve the various state-based boards and entities and come together as one was a very, very significant step in the organisation's history. In fact, I go around and present a fair bit, Julian, and so many other membership organisations just look and say, how the heck did you do that? Now, of course, I didn't do that. The board did that, and the various boards decided to merge into one, which was essentially, the kind of turkeys voting for Christmas, because many of those directors then dissolved off, for want of a better word. They dissolved away from their state-based boards, and they handed over control to a central board. So I now report directly to a board of 7 directors, and those 7 are loosely representative of the old state-based bodies.
Okay.
But actually, the most exciting part of the role is that once the organisation had decided to merge into one, the second decision they took, the board took, was to divest of AIM's training and education business. And that really, if you want the real excitement of my role, once they divested of the training and education business, so you have to remember that AIM has been known as a training organisation, an education business, for about 40 years.
Absolutely.
And AIM, well, absolutely, yeah, and but that business was sold, for want of a better word, and my organisation, I was brought in by the board to set the new strategy, following the merger of all the states and following the divestment of the training and education business. So essentially, to summarise, I was brought in to answer the question: what are we now as an institute? What are we now that we're merged, and now that we no longer are involved in training and education? And I was brought in to answer that question.
And what is the answer to that question?
I knew you were going to ask that. Okay. So the answer to that question is the thing that I find the most exciting part of the role now, and looking to the future strategy of the organisation is the answer to that question, and it's this. where AIM once saw training and education as the way to develop managers and leaders and to improve the management and leadership capability and competence of Australia, we as the Institute of Managers and Leaders no longer believe that that's the best way of improving management capability. So we fundamentally believe that the management and leadership landscape has changed and that other people do formal training and education better than we could. And in actual fact, we divested of the AIM brand. It still exists and we still own the AIM brand, but we license it to somebody else. So it's offered under license to somebody else, and people can still go on AIM training and education courses. But we, as the Institute of Managers and Leaders, are the accrediting body for management and leadership competence. So we believe that the best way to improve and increase management and leadership competence and capability is through professional development and accreditation. So we're the accrediting body for management and leadership competence, and we do that through our gold standard designation, which is called Chartered Manager. And if you want to look at that in a different way, and a way that always resonates with people, and I hope it resonates with your listeners, I'll put it like this: our charter, the things that we do, our purpose is to end the chaos of the accidental manager. We want to rid Australia of accidental managers, and we want to replace accidental managers with intentional leaders. And we believe if we do that, management and leadership in Australia can have an impact on broader society. Now, there's a heady goal for us to get our head around.
Well, it's interesting because AIM has always been, from my perspective, one of the brands that we go up against because we do the education and training piece, and their brand recognition is significant and still is to a certain extent. So it's interesting to learn and understand why the divestment was made, and I think that that accreditation process, I think that would probably be quite attractive to a lot of leaders who probably already think that they sort of had enough of the standard education and training and are probably looking for a different way to develop their skills and knowledge.
Yeah. Look, the way I think that's absolutely right. I would probably put it this way, and I'd say that I definitely think there's a place in the life cycle or the career of of managers and leaders for formal training and education. For short courses and for MBAs, and there's absolutely a place. And and there are providers, including AIM. There are providers that provide those products, really well, and they're really solid. And managers and leaders absolutely get something out of them. But for us, the development of management and leadership competence is broader than that. It's that, but it's that plus something else. And the vast majority of people, and I include myself, and I'm sure yourself and and your listeners, they typically dip in and out of formal education and training over the course of their 30, 40, 50 year careers. They dip in and out of formal training and education. Well, I see the Institute as filling the gap for when those people are not, and those gaps are huge, by the way. People spend more time out of formal education than they do in it, and we're the organisation that fills those gaps. So we have a whole suite of leadership development programs, not formal training courses, and we also own and assess the global gold standard for management and leadership excellence, and that's called Chartered Manager. And we offer Chartered Manager for people to demonstrate and prove their management and leadership competence, just as an accountant, who wants to prove that can become a chartered accountant or a certified accountant. We offer Chartered Manager as the way for managers and leaders to prove their competence, and in our words, to become intentional leaders. So of course, many of your listeners would understand the concept of accidental manager. It's the technical expert who, by dint of their technical expertise, finds herself or himself in a management position. Of course, the issue there is that being a manager is very, very different from being a technical specialist, whether that specialism is accounting or marketing or sales or whatever, or, lawyer or nurse. Managing people is very different from managing the technical side of the role. And our job is to make sure that the chaos of the accidental manager is reduced so that organizations can succeed. And we believe that organizations succeed when they have decent management in place.
So we've had a bit of a chat about sort of how you found yourself where you are now. I wouldn't mind just exploring some more general views on leadership. So what do you think?
Sure.
What do you think one of the biggest myths is about leadership that you've come across?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the biggest myth about leadership is that leaders are born and not made. I fundamentally don't believe that you're born a good leader. So the flip side of that, of course, is to say that people can learn to be good leaders. I don't think there's something innate in leadership. And my strong advice to anybody thinking about going into a leadership position, or perhaps struggling or floundering in their current leadership position, is don't despair, because you can be a better leader. And there are ways and there are skills and attributes that you can work on and develop to make you a better leader. So I quite often give a keynote speech. I did the speech in Adelaide this week to a group of executives of professional associations, and I talk about the 6 layers of intentional leadership. These are the things that we as an institute believe. The 6 things, we've distilled it to 6. I actually throw one in at the end of the presentation, so it is actually 7. Things that we believe you can learn and work on to be a better leader. So I think if we're talking about leadership in general, I don't believe that people are born to be as good leaders. I just don't believe that. I think you can learn to be a leader. And I think if more people spent time on learning leadership, in actual fact, the funny thing is, it comes back to this accidental manager thing, Julian. I think if people spent as much time on learning leadership as they do on learning the discipline that they are expert in, then I think we'd have a much better leadership landscape in Australia. So I'll give an example. I could pick any discipline, but let's take a lawyer, for example. If you want to lead a legal department, if you spend as much time learning how to lead that department as you've spent learning how to practice law, I think you'll be both a fantastic lawyer and a great leader. And that's possibly revolutionary thinking, isn't it? Because so many people think, I can be a really good lawyer and I just want to lead it. And by the way, I picked lawyers for no reason other than they just came into my head. But it could be the same as, doctors, perhaps I could give you an example. We have a partnership with Deakin University. We have a partnership with many universities, actually, Deakin and Griffith and many universities, but we have a partnership with Deakin University. And this week, we sponsored some awards at Deakin University, and I presented an award to the person that was given the Achievement Award for their MBA. And I had a chat with him just as I was presenting him the award, and I found out that he was a doctor. He ran a medical practice he was running a medical practice in Tasmania, actually, in Hobart. And I couldn't help but say to him, look, you've done 7 years of medical training. Why are you now doing an MBA? I was just curious. And he said, he said, my medical training helps me do medical stuff and, cure people and work with patients. But I actually run a team of 12 in my medical practice, and I have no idea how to manage and lead them. And I just looked at him and I said, you are the epitome of why my institute exists. And I was so delighted that we were handing him the award that we'd sponsored, because he was a classic example of somebody who had recognized he was heading down the path of accidental manager, and he was putting things in place to become an intentional leader. And one of those things, of course, was he was doing an MBA, but you don't have to do an MBA. But he was taking steps to improve his management and leadership capability, because he realized that his technical capability just wasn't cutting the mustard.
Yeah, I think you're onto something, because I've trained thousands of leaders at different levels, and the story that is so consistent is that they were technical experts, and then they got the tap on the shoulder, or someone suggested they go for a supervisor or leadership role, and then all of a sudden they're because they're so technically competent, the expectation is that they just suddenly will be leadership and management competent.
Yeah, but it's interesting, isn't it? The funny thing is, the more the Institute investigates and researches this, and we have an entire research team in the Institute. Here's something interesting that we've discovered. I mean, just from what you've said, and I'm sure your listeners will be nodding their head when they hear this, but I can't help but think that the skills you need to be a good technical expert are in many cases diametrically opposed to the skills you need to be a leader. So if you take, for example, a sales manager, the things you need to do to be a really good salesperson are in some cases, and in really big cases, in really, important areas, almost the exact opposite of what you need to run a sales team. And I find it incredible that quite often the best salesperson is given the role as sales manager. It's almost, I mean, I myself have worked for a sales manager, I won't mention the organization, who was utterly dreadful, a dreadful manager, dreadful, but a fantastic salesperson. And all he did, and in this case, it actually wasn't his fault. It was the fault of the organization. All he did was get promoted. And yet he brought those same skills in. He walked out on a Friday as the top performing salesman, and he walked in on Monday as the head of sales. And he obviously thought, well, I'll just do the same thing. But of course, the same thing caused chaos. Absolute chaos. Everybody left. And I think more and more organizations are starting to see that you need something more than technical competence. And in some cases, you don't actually need the technical competence, strangely enough, to run organizations and teams and departments. And that is the mission of our organization, or the purpose of our organization. It's to facilitate the change from accidental manager to intentional leader. And if your listeners run organizations, I encourage them to start focusing less on technical skill and more on management competence, be that through formal education or professional development. And of course, I wouldn't run an organization, that offered chartered manager if I didn't say this. Put your people through chartered manager, because it's a reflective leadership program. And that's something that's worth saying in this conversation, that chartered manager is based on the concept of reflection. And there are very few professional designations that focus on reflection. But we believe that management and leadership is at its heart a reflective process.
Well, because I know we've got a lot of listeners that might be interested in that, are you able to share a little bit more about what's involved in the chartered manager? If someone says, I've heard David and I want to investigate a bit more, what would be involved for them?
Well, interestingly, just before we spoke this morning, I'm actually partway through my own application to become a chartered manager. So it's top of my mind, and it's actually driving me mad. So let me just explain. So the chartered manager designation is obviously chartered through the Privy Council in the UK, and as all chartered marks are. So anybody that has a chartered mark, it comes from the Privy Council in the UK. So we own and assess the designation for Australia and New Zealand. So the first thing to say is you will be assessed locally by one of our registered and qualified assessors here in Australia. And there are a number of pathways to become chartered, and the pathways are based on your level of education. And when I say level of education, you may have no education, no formal education, and that's not a barrier to entry. There are just different ways of entering. So the quickest and easiest way is if you have a management and leadership based undergraduate or postgraduate degree. But don't let that put anybody off. And to illustrate why it shouldn't put people off, I don't have one of those. So I'm going through a slightly different route to chartered because I have a degree in psychology, and that's not classed as management and leadership. So I'm going through a slightly different route. But essentially, you have to fill in an application form. So to put it very, very simply, you have to fill in an application form that goes through your experience and your education and your skills and all of those kind of things. And then you go through an interview process with a trained assessor. And then you may have to do some additional either education or experience to bring you up to a certain standard, or you may not. So there are 4 or 5 different pathways to become chartered. And I have a team of people at the Institute who can help you to assess which pathway suits you the best. I'm going through what's called the non-qualified route because I don't have a management and leadership degree, but that's okay. I'm filling in the gaps that I have, some of the theoretical gaps with some online work and some interviews with some of my assessors, and it will take me about 6 months to become chartered. Now, the interesting thing, of course, through this process, many people have said to me, "Oh, that sounds like it's really hard." Well, it is hard because you're becoming chartered. So for the first time in Australia, you can become a chartered manager. I use the example, of course, of chartered accountants. You won't find too many chartered accountants who will sit there and say, "Oh, well, that was easy," and nor should they, because it's the gold standard to prove your competence. And the other thing I'd say about chartered, Julian, is, as I said before, it's a reflective process. So it's typically based around what have you done in management and leadership, how have you handled situations, and how would you have done them or could you have done them differently? And all of those questions are based around the 34 competencies that underpin the designation. So the designation is based around 34 management and leadership competencies. And all chartered managers or people going through the application process get asked questions around some of, most of, or all of those competencies. So I hope I'm giving the impression that it's both comprehensive and prestigious, because remember, you can end up as a chartered manager just as you can end up as a chartered engineer or a chartered accountant, but it proves your competence in management and leadership. And it's the first time in Australia and indeed New Zealand that managers and leaders have been able to prove their competence, or as we call it, make their mark in management and leadership.
You got me thinking about it now.
That's the intention. When I've spoken to our chartered managers, and we have about 700 of them in Australia at the moment. Those are people that have gone through the charter. The one word that I hear an awful lot is the word rewarding. People are finding it incredibly rewarding, and that's because of the reflective process. And there's something else to say about it as well, which we're incredibly proud of, and it's very unique. And it's to do with continuous professional development, or CPD. Now, CPD is the dreaded phrase amongst many people, because, of course, most organizations that have a charter or a designation have a points-based CPD process that goes with it. Well, Chartered Manager doesn't. So I fundamentally have a problem with points-based CPD, because of course the organization that offers the designation also offers the points-based system to maintain the designation. And I can't help but think that there's something inherently difficult with that process. Well, continuous professional development for chartered managers is about reflection. So you do have to go onto our portal, which, you get your number for, and you have to go onto the portal. But you don't have to do points. You have to reflect on management and leadership decisions that you've made. And that's incredibly powerful. And we believe that more and more managers should reflect and ask the question, what could I have done differently in that situation? So essentially, if I want to really summarize it, our CPD is based on keeping a diary, for want of a better word, of your management journey. And I think I'm incredibly proud of that. And I think it's both ethical for our organization not to then offer courses, with points attached to them. But I think it's incredibly important for managers and leaders to reflect on decisions that they make. We spend too little time not asking the question, what could I have done differently?
I'm conscious of time, so I did just want to explore one thing with you, in that we share a publisher, Major Street Publishing. So shout out to Leslie. I'm looking at your book right now, Leadership Matters. Yeah. Are you able to just speak a little bit to why you decided to write a book?
Yeah, of course. So I wrote a book in conjunction with the chair of the board of the Institute, Anne Messenger. So I do have to say at this point that it's not just my name on the front of that book, it's Anne's as well.
Yes.
And actually, the 7 chapters of the book, which are broadly lumped, if you like, into the 7 skills of leadership, were actually written, both one chapter was written by myself and one chapter was written by Anne. And then the rest of the chapters were written by experts in the various fields. So why did we decide to write that book? Well, actually, we always decided to write. We always intended to write 2 books. One would look at the 7 skills of successful leadership, and the next one, and we're currently working on it, it's going to be called Leading Well: The 7 Attributes of Successful Leadership. And it comes from another view of mine and a well-researched view around leadership. So I fundamentally believe that leadership is a unique blend of skills and attributes. The problem I find with leadership these days is everybody focuses on the attributes. Everybody focuses on the bits, the aspects of your personality that you need to have to be a good leader. And I think what slightly annoys me is that that's the easy bit. It's easy to talk about the inspiration of leadership. It's the kind of, in a sense, it's the kind of Tony Robbins stuff. It's the stuff where, it's the rah-rah stuff. You need to be able to motivate people. You need to be able to, inspire people. You need self-belief and all of those kind of things. But very few books and very few people and people in leadership positions where, very few of these people talk about what I like to think of not as the inspiration of leadership, but the perspiration. Because the thing is, you can inspire people as much as you like and motivate people as much as you like. But if you can't set strategy and you can't define culture and you can't make decisions and you don't have fundamental principles of ethical leadership and you don't believe in inclusion, then you're not going to be a very good leader. You're going to be pretty good at motivating people. But for me, leadership is about inspiration and perspiration. And perspiration are those things that you have to do to be a good leader, not things that you have to be. And in my own role, of course, I have to be able to motivate people and, I have to be, the nice leader, if you like. But that's not good enough for my board of directors, and nor should it be. I need to be able to set strategy and define culture and take an organization on a journey and do all that stuff that's actually quite hard work. And I think too many leadership books don't focus on that perspiration, and that's what we wanted to do. So if people are looking for a kind of really motivational book on leadership, it's not that one. It is, by the way, our next one, because we will look at that inspiration of leadership. And what we want to end up with is two books that look at the inspiration and the perspiration. And I coined a phrase, I suppose, that I think I've stolen from someone somewhere. And I think leadership is 99% perspiration and 1% inspiration. You've actually got to be able to do it, to do leadership. So that book, Leadership Matters, the 7 skills of very successful leaders, is about setting strategy, defining culture. It's about ethical leadership, and it looks at inclusion. It looks at making decisions, and that's the hard work of leadership, and that's why we wrote it, because we wanted to take that kind of road less travelled, I suppose. We're now on the easy one, and so we've signed another publishing deal with Major Street, and our next book, The 7 Attributes of Successful Leaders, will be released in October this year. And then taken together, we think what we've got there is a really comprehensive picture of leadership. But just to conclude, I think the real doing stuff of leadership is just so often ignored, you know.
Absolutely. So just 2 final questions, if I can. Are there any leaders that you look up to or inspire you, or who you think set the standard for leadership?
Well, I'll pick one who had a very significant influence on my life, and that was my boss, my immediate manager at Hewlett Packard. So she led the HR department at HP. Her name was Jane Coleman, and I put a huge shout out to Jane. Unfortunately, Jane passed away at the age of 34. She had a brain aneurysm. And both her leadership style when I worked for her at HP and her subsequent death had a huge impact on my life. And in actual fact, I dedicate Leadership Matters, the book, to her. She was a simply inspirational leader. She was a female leadership trailblazer. She was the person that introduced paid maternity leave, both to Hewlett Packard, and eventually that spread to the UK. So many people who, if you're listening to this in the UK and you've had paid maternity leave, Jane Coleman played a role in that. I would say that Jane is one of the leaders that truly inspires me. And the other one is actually my current boss. And it's always very difficult to say this, isn't it? Because people think, oh, you're just kowtowing to your current boss. I'm really not. So Anne Messenger is the chair of IML's board. She's the person that's led that board through, led the board and the organisation through what are incredibly significant changes, and has done that with professionalism, with grace, with humility, and I think both of those really strong leaders have had a very significant influence on my life. And I could say Richard Branson and Nelson Mandela and those kind of people, but you take those as read. So I thought I'd go for more local ones and more personal ones. Okay.
And any last words on leadership?
I do have one last thing on leadership, and it comes back to something I'd said before. I absolutely believe that leaders are made, not born. And for me, I think in a world where it's very, very easy to get quite depressed about leadership, and you look at political leadership, you look at things that are coming out in the Banking Royal Commission. I think it's very, very easy to get quite depressed about the state of leadership until I turn back into my organisation and I see the people that are going through Chartered Manager. I see some of our emerging leaders, so some of the younger people, in their early 20s to mid-20s and through to their 30s, who are coming along to events and talking about wanting to learn about leadership. And I suddenly get more hopeful. And I do have a very, very strong message to the leaders of, let's say, for example, the banks. And it's this: you need to take action to make your leaders in your organization, your managers and leaders, intentional, because the public deserves intentional leaders in Australian companies. It's no longer good enough not to focus on management and leadership. It's no longer good enough. And I'm filled with hope about the leadership landscape in Australia. And I think it's too easy to be depressed about it. And I refuse to get depressed because I see in my institute the really good stuff related to leadership. And typically I see people applying to become chartered managers because they want to prove that they're good leaders. And that really does fill me with confidence and hope for the future.
Well, thank you so much, David, for being part of the Synergen Leadership Podcast. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks, Julian. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Well, that wraps up another episode of the Synergen Leadership Podcast. I trust you found it interesting. A couple of things. If you could go online and leave a review of the podcast, that would be great. Really help us in spreading awareness of the podcast. Happy for you to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty easy to find. And if you want to shoot me through an email, julian@synergengroup.com.au. See you next time.